Thank you very much, Janet. Wonderful to see so many people. It's just amazing to be back, seeing people actually being able to be in front of a real person again. Lots of people standing at the back. Please feel free to come in and have a seat. This is a fairly long session. We don't want you getting tired. So please feel free to come in and sit down. It's really amazing to be back. Fantastic. I've met so many people, new and old faces, and it's really been wonderful to catch up with so many friends and make new friends at a meeting like this. And we are so happy and so fortunate to be able to be here in person, meeting and talking about ways that we can change people's lives. But as we go through the next couple of days, please let's also keep a thought for the people in Ukraine who are all suffering, and those people that have been displaced, lost their homes, lost their lives, lost their livelihoods. And the work that we're doing here will directly and indirectly also help and support them when they're able to rebuild. So let's give a thought to those people. But now it's the exciting stuff. It's thinking about how we move forward and how we launch and make therapies available to patients in Europe. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sven Kili. I'm very fortunate enough to have been in the space for a little while. I'm also fortunate enough to have worked on and had approved and launched both a cell therapy and a gene therapy in the past. And as Janet said, we've had a lot of really amazing therapies being launched in Europe. Unfortunately, not all of them are still available on the market. And so there are substantial challenges that we still face in Europe. But Europe is an amazing place. We have this incredible regulator in the EMEA that you've just heard from. This was the first regulatory authority to look at cell and gene therapies and find a way to be able to have them approved. And they've been very proactive. But the challenge that we've faced very often is that we've lost a number of these therapies because of a variety of other challenges. And as we always talk about, getting them approved is just the first hurdle. After that, we need to go into a variety of separate countries and have separate negotiations with separate regulators about making therapies available, looking at everything from labeling to filling to quality, and then obviously the big bear in the room, the reimbursement, which we'll touch on today and we'll talk about a lot more in other sessions. And so the thing we need to talk about today is Europe is an amazing place to develop therapies and commercialize them, but how can we do it better? What are the lessons that we have learned? So today in this session, we're going to hear from some trailblazing, excuse me, I haven't been talking enough recently, trailblazing cell and gene therapy developers. And these are people that are about to launch therapies, have launched therapies, and are putting in place mechanisms to effectively, efficiently launch therapies in Europe. So I'm very excited to welcome onto the stage Robin Kenselaar, Klaus Langhoff-Roos, Sissel Rodahl, and Dick Sundh. So if you guys would join me, please. I'll let you use the stairs.
Thank you.
So, welcome to the very first session. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be joined by all of you. So, I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves first, very briefly, give us an overview of who you are and your company and what you're doing. Klaus, over to you.
Sure. Klaus, I work for a company called Novo Nordisk, which next year has 100 years on our back, developing proteins and peptides for the treatment of diabetes, where we currently serve 34 million patients. For ATMPS, we work on 3 different platforms, the mRNA, gene editing, and cell therapy. We target serious chronic diseases. Personally, I work with cell therapy, heading up commercial, and we've made a couple of key strategic choices in this space. First of all, we work with allogeneic therapies. Second, we work with a portfolio of different indications in order to target where it's most biologically plausible to be successful with the cell therapies, that being Parkinson's disease, chronic heart failure, dry AMD, and type 1 diabetes. Lastly, with many of you guys in here, we're trying to cover the entire value chain from early research and all the way to commercialization. Personally, I've been fortunate to head up the latest commercialization of Novo Nordisk blockbusters, but I have to say that nothing is more exciting than working in the cell therapy space, and I'm really looking forward to us being able to bring these therapies to market. It will take some time because we're only doing first human doses this year.
Great, thank you. Sissel.
Yes, hello, thank you for having me. So my name is Sissel Rodahl. I am, I'd like to start by saying, I've been just so fortunate to have spent the last more than 4 years bringing transformative gene therapy to patients, both from a patient advocacy perspective, but also in different commercial leadership roles. And since February, I've been leading and building the commercial organization for GenSight Biologics. It's a French biotech company. It's 10 years this year since we were founded. We're developing and commercializing gene therapy with a focus on degenerative retinal diseases as well as the CNS. So we have a solid and advanced product portfolio in gene therapy within the ophthalmology space. And right now, we have a very exciting submission ongoing for Leber hereditary optic neuropathy, so LHON.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Great to have you with us. Robin.
Thank you, Sven. So, Robin Kenselaar, the head of Europe, Middle East and Africa for Orchard Therapeutics. Orchard, I joined Orchard just before the IPO in 2018, so a relatively new company focused exclusively on HSCT gene therapy, so ex vivo gene therapy. Currently, we have 2 marketed products in Europe. Very busy rolling out the launch of Libmeldy, which is the product for MLD, a neurometabolic disease, which is treated by Libmeldy, which is currently being launched. So building out the commercial structure, dealing with the hurdles that Sven described, getting reimbursements over the finish line in Europe, and building out the teams across the region.
Fantastic, thanks Robin. Dick.
Good morning, I'm Dick. I look after a company called Kite, who is dedicated to CAR T cell therapy. We've been in Europe since 4 years, roughly. It's probably the most successful until today in terms of commercializing CAR T cell therapy. We are this year selling around $1.5 billion in the world, and in Europe we'll surpass 400 million this year. We treated 1,000 patients in Europe. We're in 2 different types of CAR T cell therapies, in 2 indications currently, and we're launching in 3 very, very soon, including moving up to earlier lines of therapy. So it's been a great journey this to be in an end-of-life treatment, but there are certainly other challenges when you move up the lines here.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So as you can see, we have a really amazing panel. We've got representation in rare diseases, we've got representation in more common diseases, in cancer, in preparing for launch, in going through launch, and in having launch. So we've got a little bit of everything today. And so as you're sitting out there, I'd like you to start thinking about what are those big burning questions you've all been thinking of, and think about those, and I'll ask you to ask those to our panelists in a moment. But first of all, we're going to kick off with the most important person, the most important component of all of these therapies, and that's the patient. And so we hear over and over about the importance of patients in the development, in the approval, in the commercialization, in the rollout, in making these therapies available to other patients. So where is it that the patient can benefit with the company and the company benefit the patient the most, and where should we not be involving the patient? So let's ask maybe Sissel to start.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you asked me first, because I've worked with patient advocacy, and I must say the one thing that I learned so much from was working with the SMA, so the spinal muscular atrophy community, when I was launching a gene therapy for SMA, was their expectations of being part of every decision making in the process of bringing therapies to them. And I think we have to, I mean, we're working on it. I see a lot of change, a lot of good stuff coming out, but we have to continue to challenge patient engagement as part of our, it should be part of our mindset. It should be part of our DNA. And they should be involved in every step of the product life cycle with every stakeholder, not only us, the industry. I mean, it's obvious they have a unique insight and experience and knowledge about their disease area. I mean, who better to tell than them? And also, who better to tell us what, so trial design, what should we be measuring? What is a meaningful improvement? What would bring value to patients' lives? And HTA processes as well, they should definitely be involved there, and we shouldn't only be looking at cost and budget impacts. And then I think you also said, what should we not be doing? And I think it's just very important to be aware. And again, I'm speaking based on the fact that I've been working in the rare disease or ultra rare disease space. These groups are, I mean, they're small, potentially very vulnerable, and with few members, and they're not professionally run, let's say. So we need to build the knowledge and understanding at the patient organization level. I think that's very, very important. And they need to understand, and we need to help educate them on how complex the processes are to bring these therapies to the end user. And can I also just add, it's not about us and them. Can we please start to have a holistic approach? Can we start looking at this from a sort of disease community perspective? And within that disease community, we are all very important partners, and we should have a partnership and think a bit about it as a disease community.
Great, thank you very much. Robin, I'm going to come to you. You've been involved in rare diseases for longer than most of us can remember, both in the gene therapy, more recently with Limeldi and Stromvelis, but also in your previous life. So what were your experiences, and what are the things that we should also be watching out for?
Yes, thank you, Sven. Yeah, before joining Orchard, I was for 15 years at GenSight, where I also met Sven. So indeed, a long time in rare diseases. And I think Sissel gave us a really comprehensive view of how and where patients should be involved. I'd like to build on that. I think this notion of connecting them across the whole value chain is important, connecting them also with the clinical community, together with the companies, I think is important. Especially in rare diseases, this can be a challenge because some of those diseases are so rare that there are no dedicated groups representing that specific indication. In the case of MLD, which is the field that we're working on currently, the only dedicated MLD patient group we have in Europe is the one in the UK. So in other countries, they're sort of looked after by umbrella organizations. So that's one challenge where I think we can play a role in trying to connect those communities and see how they can help across borders. Another key lesson, I think, for me is to have a dedicated person in the organization to be the point of contact for those patient engagements. I think that's very important because they can play a role, as Sissel pointed out, in sort of the clinical development all the way up to HTA or even a reimbursement discussion. So having a dedicated person in the organization is very important. And the last sort of lesson I take is find those projects where you have a common interest. And again, going back to the rare diseases or the ultra rare diseases, one of the examples that we're currently working with patient groups on is making the case for newborn screening, because some of these diseases are genetic diseases that can be picked up through newborn screening. So that's where I think patient groups can play a key role as a very practical example.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robin. Dick, moving on to you, away from rare diseases and ultra rare into the cancer space. How does working with patients differ for those larger indications, and where should we not be working with patients, or where should we be careful?
I think it's actually quite similar to what Sissel and Robin alluded to here, because yes, they are not as rare, but still in areas like DLBCL, for example, you don't have a strong patient organization that you used in some other therapeutic areas. So some of these challenges still applies, and in some ways it's getting more difficult then because there are many more of them, right? But they don't have a clear representation like you used to in some other therapy areas. So quite a lot of connections there. Otherwise, I don't think I can share much On top of what these guys said, you said it so eloquently. I just want to reflect on an emotional level on this, that I've been in this industry for the lion part of my adult life. And there's never been a time when I've been on a personal basis with patients like this. I never received birthday greetings or Christmas greetings from patients. So I think that's a sign of kind of what value we bring to these patients and how important it is that we stay close to them.
Fantastic, really, really helpful. And so important also to communicate with them, and this is really important, is making sure that we stay open. Klaus, from your perspective, what are you encountering as you're going forward and starting to develop these therapies and thinking about first in human, and what approaches are you taking?
Sure. I think one of the questions that you asked initially is, what should we not do, right? And I've been reflecting on that while the others have been talking, and I guess what we should not do is to have a patient advisory board set up that we sit and pretend to listen to, take copious notes, and then actually not do anything about the input. So I think that when we engage with patient advocacy groups or even patients in designing clinical trials, we kind of have to listen and actually take action on what they say. And that makes it a little bit more tricky, right? Because you really, really then have to be able to act on it. So the way that we try to work with patients is like everybody else is saying, across the entire value chain, not just for ourselves, but also advocate for patients being involved in reimbursement decisions, in regulatory processes, and the rest. I think one of the challenges when you go from a rare or ultra-rare to a larger disease is that the representation or representativeness of the patient advocacy group is not necessarily always reflective of the big population. So I guess a different element is that you have to quantify and ask big scores of patients to actually validate that the input that you're getting is representative for the patient population that you're trying to solve for. One thing that I've learned that really, really works well in this instance is to work with patient anthropologists. So we employ patient anthropologists where we try to take both the insights from the advocacy groups, but take the quantification exercises as well, and somehow be able to situate what is it actually we're trying to solve for a patient population. So a translator might sometimes be helpful.
Very, very interesting, and very good insights for us as we move into those bigger indications. Great, thank you very much. So now let's look on to some of the therapies that have been approved so far in Europe. And what we've seen, many of the therapies that have been approved have had little or no comparators, active comparators or placebo comparators. And so what I'd like to ask you guys, and Robert, I'm going to start with you this time, is this sustainable? Is this something we can do going forward, particularly as we go on to larger indications? Or how should companies be thinking about their pivotal studies and their pre-approval studies in Europe?
Yeah, so this is not unique to ATMPs, I would say. This is something that the rare disease space has had to deal with all along, where if there's no comparator, if there's no effective therapy on the market, then you end up with these trials that can only look at natural history, and that can be overcome if you have a solid data set. If you involve clinicians soon enough, you can get over the finish line without a randomized controlled trial. Is it sustainable for those bigger indications? I don't think so. And also in the bigger indications, typically there are already alternatives. So then you will have to go into a randomized control trial design.
Great, thank you very much. Dick, what's your experience been?
Firstly, I think it's possible to do it without a comparator of when you're the first, right? When innovation height is really high and the unmet medical need is in your face to everybody, then we're able to get it through, right? But as we move along and we move up to the earlier lines of therapy, perhaps you're number 2 and number 3 into this space, and you come with a 10, 20, 30% advantage versus the first generation of cell and gene therapies, for example, then it's getting much more difficult, because then regulators will demand that you compare with something. And this is not like a small molecule, right, where you go to a pharmacy and buy cheaply and make a comparator arm. You're going to go and buy these kind of stuff from your competitor to do a clinical trial, which maybe they don't want you to do. It's going to be really challenging. So I think the route forward here is really to do a lot with synthetic comparator arms. And I think it has to be sustainable. So I think this is one of the areas where we really need to lobby for the regulations to say that there are a lot of innovative ways to do clinical trials, but what's preventing us from doing it is the regulatory system. And I think there are certain things that need to change there.
So maybe just sticking with that for a moment, have you had any discussions that you can tell us about with regulators about using some of these innovative mechanisms, synthetic comparator trials, historical cohorts, etc.?
Oh, absolutely. In our first indication, we created our own synthetic arm, if you like, by ensuring that we have a lot of historical data to compare with, which is cleaned in the right way and make it comparative, etc. And I don't think that we would be able to get pricing and reimbursement throughout Europe without that synthetic arm. So this was truly the success factor for us, including some innovative pricing mechanisms with them. But now when we try to do the same thing in a new indication with another product, then they're not that keen any longer. And they have a number of reasons why not, that it's quite difficult to understand, because the same reasons why they approved it the first time is what they use against us this time. So you know, at a certain moment in time, they tried to put, they were very keen on getting these first therapies approved. But once you get to number 2, 3, 4, then there's not the same prestige in getting it approved any longer. And then you start getting all these normal hurdles that you used to.
Right, excellent, very interesting. Thank you very much. Klaus, what are your thoughts as you guys are preparing and thinking about your clinical development plan and moving forwards?
Sure. I think that as we're looking at the diseases we're looking at, invariably there will be a requirement of comparator. It might not be active comparator, it might be placebo comparator. One of the challenges that is coming there is that different regulators have different perspectives on that. If you take Parkinson's disease as an example, we don't necessarily get the same guidance from EU, US, and Japan in terms of the ethical accountability that you have in terms of drilling a hole in people's head. How do you do sham surgery in a good way? So there I think that it becomes really, really interesting to figure out how we actually are navigating 3 different regulatory systems that might say something different. So that's our initial experience with that. But I have to say that at the same time that the regulators, and in particular in Japan, have been extremely forthcoming in terms of figuring out, well, if others demand something we don't demand, how do we make it work in Japan? So generally, positive approaches in the very early stages. But I do believe, to your original point, that it is not sustainable not to have comparator arms in the trials that we're running in the bigger setup. However, I agree with Dick as well that there's very different ways that you can achieve that, and it can be synthetic rather than head-to-head.
So how about thinking about, as you say, you may not be first necessarily in all of the indications that you are thinking about, but do you think about this may be similar to what the FDA has said, where they very often say, unless you really hit your first study out of the ballpark, you're going to need to have a second confirmatory study. Are you thinking about having secondary confirmatory studies in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that in all fairness, in some of the initial discussions with European regulators is that we actually do both primary and secondary confirmatory studies in Europe, and we might even do the primary ones with the placebo arm as well, simply because if you take Parkinson as an example there, you will have a regulator who will say that there is a placebo risk, and therefore they would like to see a secondary arm for that study, even if it's the first in human. So you can see different ways of doing it, right? I think this is a great example of where it would be great to have a more agile approach and figure out where do you get to with your first confirmatory study versus your second confirmatory study. And I think that to answer your question, I would maybe much more get inspired by the Japanese who do a relatively straightforward and simple primary study, and where you can, if you show innovation height enough, get a conditional approval only then to do your secondary confirmatory study with a head-to-head comparison, right? So that I think would be a really, really exciting theme to look at in the European pharmaceutical legislation. Should we be thinking about the same thing in Europe for that?
Food for thought for feedback. Sissel, what have your approaches been? How do you think about this?
So you know, with ATMPs and for rare diseases, it's often you don't have any other therapies to compare with, right? So, and when you look at the ATMPs that have been successful, it's because they've demonstrated a large magnitude of effect and on clinical outcome, and it's been recognized by payers for their transformative effects. So I would say, you know, countries that have advanced cost effectiveness methodologies and are willing to accept a long-term outcome, that's where you can really capture this effect with large quality numbers. But I mean, I think it's obvious, and I think it's been mentioned here, that as more and more treatments also are coming for the same conditions and are being approved by EMEA, it will be expected that we will and have an analysis versus comparators. So we have to think more proactively about this already when you start off and planning your clinical trials and analysis.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So I think we have to start thinking about how we plan our development programs, and we need to take some of these learnings into account definitely going forward. So moving on a little bit, we've seen and we heard from Janet earlier, we heard about a large number of products having been approved in Europe under the ATMP regulations, which is really exciting. But sadly, many of them don't still appear on the market. And so we've had a number of these withdrawn, and most of them are talking about reimbursement challenges, that there have been challenges with reimbursement. We've had a number of sessions in previous meetings. We're having some more sessions later on in this meeting talking about some of those reimbursement challenges. And so what I'd like to ask the panel is, from your experience, where are the learnings? What can we think about? And more specifically, we've heard the European regulators talk about a European-wide HTA body that might look at the cost and the value for all of the countries. What are your thoughts around this? Is this the answer? Is this the way forward, or should we be thinking of a different way? Let's start with Dick.
No, it's not. I think when I first saw that proposal, it had some merits, actually. It could have been a really good thing, but like many of these examples, it starts out with a good idea, and then with too many chefs spoiling the soup, in the end of the day, it's not that great. So I think the way the proposal is right now is not only a European HTA body, which could have been good, but it's also national ones. So what do you gain then? It's just another hurdle, right? If you get an okay in this first instance, it doesn't mean anything, because you still need to go to the national health authorities, and if you get a no, it's a no. So it's just an extra hurdle. So now for me, it's a clear no. That's not helping at all. And on your first question, which is kind of related to how do you get reimbursement of these therapies in the first run, I think there's a few things which we haven't solved for yet, and it's this ongoing thing we talk about again and again and again, right, with a one-off payment. It's perceived as a big chunk of money at one time, and the system just can't cope with that. And we've been discussing it for years now, but the system still can't cope with it. And of course, as an industry, if we can find ways for them to, let's say the patient has benefits of this treatment for 20 years, and then they will let them pay over 20 years, it would be no problem. But of course, all of us has been in this industry for a long time, and we realize that if we do that, they will find some reason that they don't need to pay after 3 years, so we're not prepared to do it. And so that one I think we haven't addressed yet. But there are a few other challenges with the uncertainty, which I think we can solve for with pay-for-performance schemes. And we would have never been able to commercialize the way we have done if we haven't been really active with pay-for-performance deals. And before I went into Kite, I had talked about these things for 10 years as a future, but I had never done one. And we always went into like, everybody's talking about a tulip rose, nobody's seen one. How do you make one? Right? And the devil is in the detail. But now we've done, I think 70% of all these deals we have is outcomes-based deals.
Very, very interesting. I'm going to change things up a little bit, and I'm going to ask Robin to comment next, because you're also looking at sort of that one-off and that one payment, and then we'll end up with Klaus looking at it more from an allogeneic perspective. So Robin.
Yes, so going back to your original question, is the European HTA the answer? And I'm afraid that Dick's right, that there are still quite a few hurdles. In principle, it's a good idea, but it all depends on how good are the systems to then sort of generalize the outcomes of that. So I think there's still some work to do there, but the principal idea, I think, is a good one. When you then get to the reimbursement step, because the HTA is just the clinical step, right, assessing the clinical value, once you get to the reimbursement stage, we struggle with the same things. And we do see, however, that the systems are moving and that there's more, let's say, willingness to consider outcome-based risk share type schemes. And it's early days for us. We've announced the price that is agreed in the UK and Scotland recently as well. And in Italy, so we're in the middle of that. But we do see that there is a greater willingness to consider, payment by result, payment at result schemes, or different ways to share the risk, if you like. So I do see there's movement there.
Very, very positive. So fingers crossed that you'd be able to move that needle forward. Sissel, what are your experiences in this space? Are we going down the right route of a European-wide HTA organization?
So I'd first like to ask, actually, a question. Will this accelerate access for patients? Can we just keep that front and center, please? Clarity for us in the industry, of course, that would also be very, very helpful, but I think it will remains to be seen whether it can provide faster access for patients. And we need to be mindful, this will focus on clinical value alone, not on joint negotiations, obviously. And I'm just afraid that countries will not be bound by the outcomes of this, and that they will still be requesting national submissions and their own local stuff, and double the work and the delay. So just to challenge that a little bit. And yeah, we need to see how is the methodology going to look like. But I've also had the experience of negotiating with innovative payment schemes for multiple countries, and there is a willingness. There's clearly a willingness to look at that, but there are also a lot of hurdles to getting it implemented. Things like how do you follow up, how do you collect the data that is needed, and even the GDPR regulations can be a barrier there. So yeah, can we just keep can we accelerate the access for patients first and foremost? That's what we need to focus on.
Great, thank you. So yeah, patient center at everything we do. Klaus,
sure.
You're looking at allogeneic therapies. Is this European-wide HTA body the solution?
I think Dick mentioned the devil is in the detail in a different context, but I think in this one, also the devil is in the detail. I guess some of the reasons why it's difficult to get reimbursement for ATMPs in Europe or keep them reimbursed is because we have very limited clinical data and we don't have long-term follow-up, right? So to the extent a European HTA methodology can change that and take that into consideration and recognize the value of ATMPs, accepting that there's limited data at launch and accepting that there's no long-term follow-up, then it can be a benefit. However, I share sort of some of the concerns with the panel here, is that if that is not the case, then it will become an additional hurdle and just delay access to medicines for patients. But if it can be done in that way, I think that would be really, really good.
Yeah, but what would you gain if you get a yes there and you still need to go negotiate, like to Sissel's point?
Yeah.
Right, yes, if this was the decision step,
yeah.
I would be all for it.
Yeah.
But the way the proposal is now, that is not the decision step.
No.
There's another one locally anyway.
No, I agree, and I guess to the extent that some European countries, they have no HTA, which means that could be an upside to say, if you do have an HTA positive here, then there might be a learning for this country to drive through. And secondarily, most of the countries that do have HTA schemes, they do not have a fit for purpose for regenerative medicines HTA. So to the extent this can be a blueprint for what it looks like, that's great. But I agree with you that it comes at a big risk, right? Because there has to be a backing of that this is the HTA methodology to recognize little data, no long-term follow-up, but we're still going to assess the value based on this limited data. If we can do that, I can see that this could work.
But do we not run that risk of the countries, as you say, that already have an HTA organizations, NICE, AMNOG, they're going to put their hands up and say, well, we've been doing this for so many years. We feel we do it better than anyone else. We feel we're a world leader in the space. Everyone quotes us. So we're just going to keep doing what we were always doing, and we're not going to listen to the European-wide system. Do we run the risk of ending up with a two-tier system, as it were?
We probably do, Sven, and I think there's a great disparity between those different systems. You mentioned NICE and AMNOG. They're quite different, and so there's no let's say generalizable system right now. So there is that risk that it will create that extra hurdle.
Klaus.
No. So first of all, I guess NICE is not part of the EMEA anymore, right? So, and I think
wishful thinking.
But in all fairness, I think the UK with their innovation passport and with early access and access to both HTA discussions as well as regulatory, I think that's a really, really good thought, at least, and a good model. And maybe we could also get inspired from that with the EMA with early regulatory discussions as well as an HTA methodology that actually could work in this space. So I think that there's plenty of opportunity in that, honestly.
Fantastic. Okay, great. So I'm going to put some questions open to the floor. Is there anyone out there that has a burning question to ask? We have the microphone box. So if it gets given to you, introduce yourself briefly and then your question, please.
Hi, I'm Eliza from APM Health Europe. It's a question for Robin, but anyone can answer it. So Scotland's NHS agreed to reimburse Livmeldy last week, but the SMC chair urged Orchard and the pharmaceutical industry in general to be more, not effective, improve efficacies, basically. He said that the industry is inefficient, and that's why gene therapies are so expensive. I was just wondering what you make of that. Is that true? Yeah.
Okay, let's give Robin a chance to answer first, and then we'll ask the others to get in. So, challenge to make it more effective or efficient?
Yeah, I think it was efficient. That's the word that she used when I remember the quote. Yeah, and I think this, first of all, this is a very, it's a new price level, right? The price level for Livmeldy is new to most systems, both in England when NICE approved us, as well as in Scotland. I think this is the case for any new innovation, that you start off and hopefully you will become more efficient over time. And then stepping back maybe to looking at the price tag itself, because that is the one-off payment that sort of people are reacting to. At the same time, we see that, for example, NICE looked at the effect of Livmeldy over, I think it was 20 years. So if you look at that price and you look at the 20 years that the HTA body sees the price in that context, and divide that price by 20, and it's sort of on par or maybe even below some of the therapies that we see today for those very rare neurometabolic diseases. And the same happened in Germany, where GBA looked at the effect for Livmeldy over the course of 15 years. So now take that price and look at it over 15 years, and there's if you understand the biology of stem cells, you can even predict that the 15 or the 20 years it will even be longer. So that's what I would have to say to that. Yeah.
Dick.
I think it's also important to recognize that we don't charge on a cost plus basis. The cost of producing this has no relevance for the price of what we sell it for. The price is the value of the product compared to the alternative. Okay? And if this is cheaper, then the alternative will get it approved. And if it's not, we won't. So, and cheap is not the price. It's the price per the value you're delivering, right? And especially in the Scottish and the UK system, it's a system that is designed to measure whether you are providing a benefit which is worth the cost you're asking. And if it's not, they want reimbursement. That if it is, it is. So, but then coming to the next part of that, I actually think that this drive for us to be more efficient is a fair one, absolutely. This is the first time we've done it. We don't get it right the first time. Look at our company. We built a 130 million euro factory in Amsterdam to produce this. And yeah, we're getting better and better each day. And if you look at the efficiencies we've been driving in this factory the last year, it's massive. So if I look ahead 5-10 years on where we will be, absolutely there is room for improvement here. But I think asking us to both have a high innovation here and be incredibly efficient with our processes first time we do it, I've never seen it, so I think this will come over time.
Yeah. Sissel, any comments from you or from Klaus?
Well, I mean, you already said it. It's based on value, right? It's not a cost plus model, and it's still early days, and it is a very complex. It's complex manufacturing. It's complex bringing it to the patients, to the countries. So, but we also have to show that it's worthwhile, and we also need to face. We need more investment in this space. We need investors to see that, wow, this is worthwhile investing as opposed to IT or any other industry. So unfortunately, we need to carry that cost in these early days, but I'm sure that's going to improve. But still, we have to realize that we have to pay for the value it brings. And then let's look at what does that look like, how can we, and again, because it's one-time therapies and it's a high upfront cost, how can we manage that over because it is a lifetime potentially of benefit. These therapies are designed for a lifelong benefit, and that's pretty amazing, the transformative potential they have.
Klaus?
I think the only thing that I would add is that if you look at it and from a European perspective, EU perspective, then there's really two things that people are trying to achieve in the EU, right? One is to get affordable medicines out to many patients, and the other one, having a really innovative and world-leading ATMP sector. And sometimes it's as if these two are separate in different directions, but in all fairness, I think one of the ways that you get an innovative ATMP sector is by giving access to the medicines that you're actually developing. I can say for us clearly that our default investment will be in the US, because we know there's an innovation drive and innovation is being used. I think maybe the EU pharmaceutical strategy is trying to address some of this as well, as to say, in order to be successful as an ATMP sector in Europe, you also have to have a demand side that actually works. So this, I think, is an opportunity for us. To Janet's point earlier about the first the 20-year celebration of actually being able to look at the European pharmaceutical legislation again. That's a really nice opportunity to improve on the demand side.
So there we have it. Europe needs to become a real innovation site from a consumer, not only from a producer's perspective. And so this is maybe something that we as an area, as an economic area, should be potentially thinking about, being willing to pay for that innovation. And I think the points made about the benefit that these therapies provide to patients are truly groundbreaking. And we've gone a number of years now where we've had a number of therapies approved, and to an extent we're still we're somewhat blasé about being able to give a child an injection, and you have not only saved their life, but you've allowed them to have a normal life potentially for the next 70 or 80 years. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. And we will get better at this, absolutely, but we're going to be challenged initially. So thinking about this, and thinking about this sort of limited approach that we've had to date, due to the complexity of administration of advanced therapies and the low numbers that we've typically seen within Europe to date, we've had very limited sites that are capable of administering these therapies to patients, both in a clinical trial setting, but also from a commercial perspective. What do you think the benefits and the risks are of this approach, and how is this likely to change as we have more therapies coming and hopefully with bigger indications? And Klaus, maybe we'll start with you putting your allogeneic hat on.
Cool. I think that there are things that we as industry or competitors or collaborators should be doing and together. to make things easier for our customers. And I can't help but think, like, one example being registries. When you take a clinical site, they have to follow up with the patient, put them in a registry of some sort. It's kind of our obligation that we make sure that it is one registry and the processes are similar. And to someone else's point earlier, finding common projects where all are winners, both from a patient advocacy perspective as well as from an academic, as well as from a site perspective. This is, I think, a really, really good example of having us as an industry work together and make life more easy. The other obvious challenge that you have is that for the sites, when you're first, then the sites will know your procedure, and when someone else comes, how will they then have to learn for the next procedure and a new certification? That kind of gets tedious and messy. I guess that as long as the market, if you will, for ATMPS is to be expanded a lot, then maybe we as an industry should not compete so much on who has the best certification program. But we also have to be realistic at some point in time. If it's a really crowded market, there will necessarily be a competition about who has the best certification and support set up for you as a clinic to manage these patients the easiest way possible, I think. But right now, we're like in the early phase, so I imagine that we could collaborate a lot on making life easier for clinical sites and commercial sites for that matter.
Sissel, as you're moving forward and more advanced, how do you think about these clinical sites and the expertise that's required?
I see a lot of benefit, actually, because, and again, speaking, with rare disease and ultra-rare disease experience, it's a higher likelihood that patients will receive top-notch care, that they reach, of course, provided they reach the relevant center of excellence. And also speaking from the GenSight perspective, it's the viability for a more lean go-to-market model. And I think also from a payer perspective, it gives them the reassurance that the strict inclusion-exclusion criteria are being followed. And of course, we're bound by the need for data collection, the ability for long-term follow-up. And these things are really important, and I think limiting the number of centers is actually very, very beneficial in that sense. So, and what could be the downsides? Well, I guess reaching. So if the referral patterns aren't well structured, it can take a long time for the patient to actually reach the right place they need to go to get the treatment, and it's harder for the young rising stars among physicians to get the necessary experience that they need within the rare disease, and potentially a political fight among centers, I guess.
Very, very interesting. Robin, you've lived that moving from a single administration site to numerous sites around Europe. What are your thoughts and feelings and experiences around this?
Yeah, absolutely, Sven. So, yeah, here is, I think, where our interest and the interest of the healthcare system align, because there's an efficiency that you need to have. I mean, if we look at our latest launch for MLD, if you look at the incidence in the literature, which is with ultra-rare diseases always a bit questionable, because do we really know? But let's say in Europe there's about 100 patients born every year. So by definition, you cannot afford to have, let's say, every hospital in every city in Europe administering this therapy. You have to concentrate care. And in the case of those rare diseases, you need to combine both the knowledge of the indication itself, so a deep knowledge of the lysosomal storage disorders, combined with the technical capability of handling cryopreserved cells and transplant capability. So that leads automatically to a concentration of knowledge and delivery. So right now in Europe, to give you an idea, we have about 5 centers qualified. We probably have a couple more, but that's it. It's not going to be a therapy that's going to be administered across every city in Europe. And I think that has also an advantage. It allows for specialization, it allows for efficiency, but it does require good referral pathways. And it also poses another challenge for us, and that is cross-border reimbursement, just to throw in a curveball here, which we had to deal with, especially in the times when we had only one center in Europe, and by definition, people had to sort of organize cross-border reimbursement. So that's another field that we're pioneering. Everything we do is pioneering, but also on this reimbursement and cross-border reimbursement topic. This is where, it's an additional hurdle, but it can be overcome.
Great, thank you. So Dick, moving to you, more of the oncology side, theoretically more centers. What has your experience been?
Yeah, not surprisingly, it's very, very different from these stories. So at the moment, so we've been on the market for about 4 years in Europe, and at that time we've aggregated close to 180 centers throughout Europe, and I have a plan to go to 350 quite soon. So it's really about scale here, and we've learned, to your point about efficiency here earlier, the first centers we did, we had one in France. We were there with several people in the center every week, hand-holding, and it took 6 months to qualify them. And now we do it in 2 weeks over Zoom. So definitely there's a learning curve here, and we're getting much better and better at it. And for us, despite these 180 centers, roughly half of the patients that needs the therapy get access today. So it's both about breadth and depth here. So I need to get those 180 centers to have a higher utilization, but we also need to get to 350 in order to ensure that these patients really, and as many patients as possible, can benefit.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. So there, once again, it's the patient at the center of everything we do, that we make sure that we have these therapies available to them. So before we go on to our last question, we've got time for one more audience question, one quick question. We've got one back there. I can see someone with their hand up. Is it Janet?
Chair's prerogative, I guess. Is it working? Yeah. I wondered if you could speak to the lessons learned and to the extent you can, the particulars of your experience in establishing pay-per-performance agreements with payers. In what ways did the agreements that you've reached, been different than maybe you expected on the way in? What's been the learning of establishing pay-per-performance agreements in Europe?
So I think the first is to be very clear about what is it that we should measure. And for us, that has been overall survival. So it's a very easy data point to measure, right? There's no interpretation of whether this patient have a residual disease or not. Either they're alive or they're dead. And then we just need to take the hit then that sometimes they die of other things. But we just measure whether the patient is alive at a certain data point or not. And that makes it a lot easier for the system then to track. And this is the biggest hurdle we have when implementing this going earlier in the lines of therapy. So in our case, second line DLBCL, which we hopefully will have reimbursed next year, that's in second line. It's not an end-of-life disease. So what's the role of survival then? And how do I avoid then that the payer will say that, yeah, but if you treat with something subsequently, then I won't pay you because, and you need to have quantification of how much of that efficacy is attributable to your drug and what's second, etc. So certainly difficult when you move up the lines. But in end of life, I think the learning is to make that data point very clear at what time point, and do something which is not open for interpretation in terms of whether they hit the measurement point or not.
So the subjectivity needs to be taken out, and it has to be that absolute binary endpoint.
Well, it has to be, but it certainly makes it easier to make these things work.
Sissel.
Yeah, can I just add there that what I found interesting is how all the responsibility is on the industry side. I would say 99% of the cases. So how you need to, it's the way you approach it. So you need to approach it very broadly. You need to engage with payers very early, establish partnerships, and try to understand what are their needs. Try to put yourself in their shoes, and that kind of is like a dance in a way, and it takes quite a long time. And again, I'm mindful it's early days, but. Since three of us here are from the Scandinavian countries, I thought maybe just to share some experience from Scandinavia, where I think in Norway was actually the first country that I saw that established a framework for how, you know, for not how it could look like, but more what it should not look like. And that's already very helpful. Whereas in Sweden, we engaged on a very, I would say, academic discussion, highly scientific. It was super exciting. And then when everything was done and dusted, oh no, we can't do it because we can't collect the data in the way that we need to collect it. So you need to start earlier, but you also need to understand what are you going to measure? How can you get that data? So I think that's just...
Thank you. Robin, from your side, you don't have as many patients, so if one dies from an unrelated risk, you can't not get paid. How have you approached this?
Yeah, so this is where working through qualified treatment centers actually helps. Because there patients are followed up, you do have more sophisticated measures than just are they alive or not. In our setup, it would have to be disease-related to death. We're not gonna, we can't afford otherwise, right? So, and working through the QTCs gives us that flexibility to be slightly more sophisticated. But what we find is that during the dance that Sissel describes, it's important to have the optionality, to have the willingness to engage and think about different systems. At the end of the day, you tend to end up with a rather simple scheme in the end. Maybe a little bit more sophisticated than are they alive, but it's a fairly simple set of measurements that the systems will be looking for.
Klaus.
And then I think just one comment on that. The next thing is to ensure that people understand that this is about managing risk on both sides. So that means when I deliver on my promise, you pay me full. Not a 20, 30, 40% haircut. When I deliver, it's full payment, it's list price.
Agree.
But in return, when I don't deliver, I give you a significant discount or maybe under certain circumstances even for free.
Agree.
So it has to benefit both sides.
Exactly.
Klaus, anything from your side?
No, very briefly, just that I learned now that if you have hard outcomes such as death, you can do it, right? And it becomes possible. For most of our treatments, all of them, it's going to be really difficult to do that. And secondly, I've learned that if you have a rare condition, you can really follow up the individual patient. Where if you're looking at bigger chronic diseases, you're not going to be able to do that. However, I do think that just as you were saying, Sissel, as an offer to our payers, we have to be able to offer up what could it look like in order to be a credible partner and help them to navigate that. But I think that in reality, it's going to be really difficult to administer.
Yeah, I think very nice summary. At the end of the day, we know our therapies best, working with the patients, and it's up to us to go to the regulators or to the payers and to propose a framework. And as we've heard, there's not one size fits all. And this is really, really important. These are highly individualized therapies. These are highly individualized individuals that are being treated, and not every patient has read the medical textbook. And so it's important that we treat each patient differently, and the same for the approvals. Okay, so very, very interesting. Thank you very much. We're going to end off with one quick question, and I'd like you all to be brave and controversial and honest. And as we're thinking about, and as we've heard a little bit earlier, the European Union is going to be updating the ATMP legislation later on this year. So I'd like to ask each of my panelists, we'll start with Klaus, what is the one thing that you want included in that revamp?
It would be a dedicated ATMP pathway with early and frequent and competent advice.
Fantastic. Sissel?
Can I have two wishes?
Okay.
So, first of all, rules, so EU rules for evidence generations to satisfy both the regulators and the payers. That will be very helpful. And the second one, and I think that's been my mantra today, it's accelerating access for patients. Can we force the member states to accept the outcome of the joint EU clinical assessment? And can we have in place or ensure a system for paid early access so that once you have the EMA approval, basically patients can have access. Like we see early access in Germany, like the ATU in France, We see in Austria as well, and even in Portugal. These are countries that can provide paid early access for patients with ATMPs while you figure out whether it's an innovative payment scheme or whatever. So those would be the two things. So evidence generations to serve both purposes and accelerated access for patients.
Great. Robin, what are your thoughts?
At a high level, just reducing the heterogeneity that we see today. And that could be around sort of the scope of hospital exemptions that we have, which is very important in the HSCT gene therapy. Differences in how indications are reimbursed. Are certain subgroups excluded in one member state versus another member state? I think those are two concrete asks.
Dick?
I hope it will be open for less of interpretation and a bit clearer. That would really help. I think the legislation has been very helpful. I think it will continue to be helpful, but there are too many gray areas where we draw our own conclusions on certain things, and I would like to have some more clarity.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So there you have it. Really critical, as we've heard, this is a developing industry. All of the companies here that you've seen and all of those that you're going to speak to are still learning. They're optimizing how they manufacture, they're optimizing how they develop. The same should go for the regulators. They should learn from the past and they should optimize the regulations as they go forward together. So that's the end of this session. I'd like you all to join me in thanking my panelists for sharing their expertise and their experience, and some of them their scars. And we look forward to catching up at coffee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.